Hello, everybody. I'm just waiting for the participants to join us. There you go. I see the cameras coming on, and hopefully you can see all of us. I wanted to say hello to everybody to start. You'll notice that I'm not saying good morning or good afternoon. And the reason for that is very simple, actually, that it seems that we are a very global audience. We literally do cover many time zones, and that's thoroughly appropriate given what we are here to discuss. So the focus of our discussion today is on global futures and urban science. And you will have seen the rationalization or the rationale for this meeting and for the focus of it. We know that urban growth is driving environmental change, not just and that is at an unprecedented scale. So whether we're talking about freshwater systems, biogeochemistry, or biodiversity, there are systems that are in crisis, and all of that connects to the process of urbanization. And so getting a handle on that link between cities, the global system, how it's changing, how we might be able to influence our urban futures in ways that are beneficial for ourselves, for future generations, and for the planet is really what we're here to be talking about. I'm going to introduce you to everybody in a second and to tell you who they are and why they come. But before I do, I just want to put in a quick advert. I don't know if you noticed when you were signing up for this webinar that there are in fact two webinars. There's this webinar and one next week. They're twins, if you like. Today, we're going to focus on the question of what do we mean by an urban planet, or the impact of cities on Earth systems and the idea of a new urban science. And next week, we're going to take that into a discussion more about urban science and global policy, that translation of what we know into what we do. But I don't want us to see these as completely separate. We're really hoping that quite a lot of the people who are here today will also be present tomorrow. And for those of you who are listening on a recording, that you might have even started with the seminar on global policy and come back into today's session. And so that's completely appropriate. We'll try and make sure that there'll be differences, but that there will also be synergies between the two sessions. They're different people on the panels, and so you'll hear slightly different views. But just so that you know who we are and where we've come from, and hopefully what we're bringing into the discussion today, everybody who is on the panel is associated in some or another way with a project known as Peak Urban. And there is a web link. You can follow up loads and loads of material attached to the Peak Urban program, and we'll try and explain in a little while exactly what Peak did or what it meant and why we think it's a useful entry point into this really complex issue of how you understand the relationship between cities and global processes. More specifically, okay, if you're looking for follow-ups of things to read, or maybe you've read these pieces and that's why you want to hear what some of the authors, because both Karen and Tim, who I'll introduce you to in a second, were authors on these two pieces that I'm going to highlight now. You can look up the links, and we'll give you the links to a piece out in the journal Nature Sustainability and another one in the journal Science. And we'll pop those links up for you. If you're wanting to read, I know some people find it easier to read rather than just to listen, or to read and to listen in processing information. There's also a really nice piece that the Financial Times did, authored by Michael Keith, who was the principal investigator of the Peak program about urbanization. And it's a really sharp distillation of some of the core arguments that we are trying to get to. So before I introduce you to Tim and Karen, now maybe this is a good moment. Karen and Tim, can we maybe introduce ourselves? I'll start with me, having nattered on already. My name is Sue Parnell, and I'm your chair for today. I promise not to talk all of the time. I am based here at the University of Bristol. in the United Kingdom, but I also am an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town at the African Centre for Cities. And my interest in cities is really primarily a policy question, I suppose. It's how do cities change? So that's who I am. I'm chairing. Tim, can we go to you? I'm not terribly sure which city you're in today.
I am in Oxford today. Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Schwanen. I'm Professor of Transport Geography at the University of Oxford, where I lead the university's Transport Research Institute, and I was one of the co-investigators on the Peak Urban project.
Thanks, Tim. Karen.
Hello, everyone. I am Karen Seto. I am a professor at Yale University in the School of the Environment. I am trained as a geographer, and I study urbanization at local to global scales.
Great. And you got up quite early, I think, this morning, Karen.
Just a little bit earlier than normal.
Good. Well, it's great to have you with us. And I think there may be even some people further out to the west there. Okay. So Karen was on the advisory board of Peak, and this is not a webinar only about Peak. We're trying to take the ideas which were born of Peak, if you like, and to begin to start taking those a step further. And perhaps just to be clear, I think there are three elements we're going to try and pick up on over these two seminars. So the first is really this question of kind of how and why, how do we measure the global impact of urban change? Okay, in other words, how do we understand its volume, its scale, its pace, what is it? How do we measure it? That's the first thing. And then secondly, and associated with that, is how do we understand how cities work, and the way that our understanding of how cities work, how does that feed into our understanding of the changes that are triggered by city transformations, so the wider changes that are figured by city transformations. And then I suppose the third element of this is really, if we've tried to measure and think and understand the process, we've got some idea of what it might trigger or catalyze, then how do we use that knowledge to inform the policy priorities at the global scale? So nobody's saying that local processes are unimportant. That's not what we're on about now. But what we are saying is that cities have an impact at a global scale. So, and that's sometimes talked about as a global urban science. So let's get into the business of it, and start to kind of really get to grips with it. So maybe you can just help us with this question of sort of how do we think about cities and their change? Maybe use the Peak framing. Tell us what the Peak project was about. Many people won't know, and even those who do, it might be useful just to have a bit of a reminder, a revision class on why that helps us think about cities.
Of course, yes. So Peak was a program that was funded by the UK government agencies for research, and it was a collaboration of 5 institutes with a very strong record in urban research. So it was the African Centre for Cities, where Sue was based. It was Afit University in Medellin, Colombia. It was the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. It was Peking University, and it was University of Oxford, where Michael Keith was based, and a couple of others. And later, Bristol became involved in the project as well, primarily via Sue. And Peak was really about trying to understand change in cities, and it did that by means of this acronym, the P, the E, the A, and the K, where the P was about prediction, was about trying to see how you can use the new data sciences to understand some of the regularities, some of the recurring patterns in cities. Because cities in many ways are processes or systems that are characterized by all kinds of path-dependent developments, things that have emerged in the past and that keep sort of that keep recurring. So there's a lot of stability in that system. That's what you can predict. But then there's only part of the story, because there's also a lot of novelty emerging, and cities, perhaps par excellence, are the sites where new things emerge, because you get all kinds of unexpected encounters and frictions that lead to new forms of creative solutions, new creative practices, ideas, technologies, and so on. So that is really what that E, the emergence, was about. And adoption is then about how things scale, how things grow, how they travel through cities, both within cities and between them, because we also need to think about cities as very much networked in the 21st century. And then the K was about knowledge exchange, was about really bringing together different types of knowledge and getting different knowledge communities or epistemic communities to engage in meaningful dialogue with each other. And the primary means by which we try to do that in Peak was by training a new cohort of early career researchers who would be able to work in a radically interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary manner, which meant that they were able to sort of bridge the divides between data sciences and more traditional social science, even humanities types of research, where we're talking about qualitative research, qualitative data, and sort of try to build meaningful hybrids of these types of knowledge about the city, of knowing the urban. But it was not only about knowledge and about science, it was also about people being able to communicate in a meaningful way with policymakers and as part of policymaking processes. So also being able to speak in City Hall and in all kinds of other communities where policies get made. And this already gets at something that we thought was going to be very important with Peak, and that was about impact, about creating impact through the research, through the co-construction methodologies that were often used, and changing the way the urban develops and how urban policy got done. And we tried to do that at multiple geographical scales. And I think with hindsight, it's fair to say that the individual research projects within Peak were very good at creating impact at the scale of individual cities and at the scale of nation states, the national scale. I think what we were also hoping to achieve from the early phases of Peak onwards is to create impact at that higher level, the supranational, the global level, where a lot of things have been happening. And of course, a key aspect there is SDG 11, the Urban Sustainable Development Goal, which was formulated, it was in sort of the middle of about 10 years ago now, and in many ways is a centerpiece of recognition of the importance of the urban to the global problems that we're facing. But the SDGs come sort of in the final stage of their life cycle. So we need to think about what comes after that. And the debates around the urban at the global scale have also changed, partly because of the pandemic, about COVID, because what we saw there was that cities were perhaps the most vulnerable sites in terms of the infection spreading and people being affected. And what the pandemic showed very clearly is that it was first and foremost in cities that the social inequalities that were written into the pandemic sort of were being articulated. And I think we've seen a bit of a shift in the policy discourse since the pandemic, where cities are not only important in terms of generating economic development, but also about resilience and thinking about vulnerability, thinking about social inequalities. At the same time, we see that in other environments and other policy communities, the urban gets more and more attention. And a very good example of that is what has been happening around climate change and the IPCC in particular, where the latest assessment report had a separate chapter on the urban as a site where climate change is both experienced and generated. And Karen was one of the key authors of that chapter, and I'm sure we'll be able to talk more about. And what we tried to do with these two papers that were mentioned before, the nature sustainability and the science paper, was to sort of make an argument that on the one hand, we need a new narrative of what sustainable urban development is, that takes account of this renewed emphasis on social inequality and resilience, and does that by drawing on systems thinking, complexity science in a way that stretches across many disciplines and brings together insights from many disciplines. That also means better engagement with policymakers to kind of convey those knowledges. And I think what the science piece in particular was trying to do was trying to think through the architecture of how that science policy interface at the global level should be designed. And I think it's fairly clear that we had many interesting and inspiring discussions as a team of authors. But one of the things I think that we all agreed on was that the IPCC was probably not the best model for shaping that science policy interface. We needed something that is more agile, perhaps more cost effective. And actually in the science paper, we make the recommendation that following the setup of the Committee on Development Policy under the UN's Economic and Social Council may actually be quite a nice way of thinking about this. We formulated a series of principles in that papers about how that new organization or that new interface might be structured, which was very much about bringing many sciences together, really bringing in science and perspectives and voices outside of the global north, but particularly from Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, in a transdisciplinary manner and in a way that really synthesizes the knowledge that we have already. Because I'll give, as an example, we can think about things like urban heat islands. There's now a lot of studies that have looked at urban heat islands in specific cities, sometimes even at national scale. But I don't think we know what the aggregated effect is of all the urban heat islands we have on the planet, what that means in terms of global temperature rise, but also in terms of health effects, ecologic effects. And what we hope, what we feel is really needed is provide the synthesis of that knowledge about individual cities, about individual countries. Bring that together and communicate that in an effective way to the global policymakers at UN level and with the global charities and NGOs that are active in this space to really sort of offer that synthesis in a policy relevant manner. And I think that's what we wanted to achieve with the project and the subsequent activities and the two papers we've been talking about today.
Thanks, Tim. That was hugely clear and sharp. I mean, just a sort of sense of kind of, we need to understand, and we can increasingly understand if we work together what goes on in an individual space. But cities don't just operate at that space. They also have and are taken up politically and have impact nationally. And then this recognition that they also matter globally and therefore have to be thought about in new and different ways, and that's got to keep moving with the way that the world is changing and the way that cities are changing. And that panel that came together, just if you have a look at the list of authors on that nature sustainability panel, and you don't just look at the name, you look at really where they come from, I think you'll get a real sense of a fairly diverse group of global thinkers, I suppose, trying to grapple with this question of what should our storyline be? What's the narrative arc of what we've got to be able to do and achieve and what we want to be able to achieve? Karen, I want to bring you in here because you were at that Oxford meeting, and you'd been involved with Peak, but only indirectly in the board. But you were very influential at that meeting in talking about and bringing kind of terms like an urban planet or Earth systems and the idea of working at the global. I wonder if you can just give us some sense of why should we do that? Why were they important? What do those terms actually mean? That'd be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And thanks for having me on this panel. The language is so powerful in how we frame the issue. And you alluded to this in your opening remarks that for a long time, we conceptualized the urban or cities as having impacts only locally. And while cities certainly have local impacts, the scientific literature is very clear that cities as places, but maybe even more so urbanization as the process, actually has planetary effects. And that's how the term urban planet or urbanizing planet came to be, is reframing. I want to underscore something again that you said earlier, that the local is extremely important. Understanding how cities affect their local environment is very, very important. We've known that for a long time. What is newer is this framing that on aggregate, if you take all the cities in the world, all the towns, how they're urbanizing, the resources required to build the built environment, buildings, roads, schools, houses, those resources come from places that are not in the city. And the food that's required, that actually has an impact, an imprint on the planet. And that's how the term urban planet came about. And this idea of urbanization affecting the Earth system is this really important framing. And here, I just want to take a moment to explain what I mean and what the literature means by Earth systems. I mean, the Earth is, we have one Earth, but the Earth is comprised of multiple systems. We can break apart the Earth as there's the land system, there's a water system, there's a biospheric or living system, right? Plants, animals, and then there's the atmosphere. So there's the air. So those are four critical systems on the planet that interact. If we think about urbanization as a process, urbanization is the physical transformation of land. You build parking lots, you build buildings. So urbanization transforms the land. And by building cities, we transform the hydrosphere, we redirect rivers, we change waterways. By building cities, we change the underground water system as well. In fact, many cities around the world are sinking. Coastal cities are sinking because literally the weight of the buildings and sucking up the water, the underground water. So urbanization is changing water systems. It's very clear that urbanization is changing the biosphere, all the living things. When we build roads, we fragment habitats. We cut apart the places where living things live. We cut down trees. So we reshape the biosphere. And by using cars, buggies, tuk-tuks, air conditioning, heaters, we emit emissions, carbon emissions, and that goes into the atmosphere. And in fact, urban areas contribute to about 70% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. That includes carbon, CO2, as well as methane. So if you take all of these four systems, the land, water, living things, air, it's very clear that urbanization is one of the biggest drivers in the Earth system. And yet, the framing that we have had as a science community, and I think as a policy community, is that, oh, cities don't really matter because they're so small. And I mean, this is kind of the irony, is that cities take up less than 4% of the planet's surface. And I would argue that that offers an incredible opportunity, because we're not trying to manage the entire planet. it's 4% of the Earth's surface, has this incredible effect on the entire planet. With sound management policies, institutions, we could have an incredibly positive impact. And I think this is where the Peak Project is so important, and the points that Tim made about how do we take this science, all these different pieces, and aggregate it up so that policymakers, both at the local level, but increasingly at the international level, understand how we can shape local policies. And here I just want to end with one point, which is that if we don't have some kind of globally coordinated strategy, if we don't have a North Star of this is where we need to go and this is how we're going to get there, all these individual efforts, it's unclear that they're all going to lead to where we need to go. It's like an orchestra. Without a, who's that person? I should know, the conductor, right? I mean, I'm not saying that we need a conductor. But we need to have a sense of what's the score we're trying to play, right? What are we trying to put together? Otherwise, all these different instruments are going their own way.
Thanks, Karen. The urban orchestra, I love it. But before I'll let you both of you off. Karen and Tim happen to be two of the world's experts in their field, and I want to put I just want you to tell us practically how we do some of these things. So, I mean, Karen, let's just start with you. So you've made the case, and I think you make it well, that cities really change global systems. Okay, they fundamentally do that. But can you just give us an example of how do you do that kind of research to demonstrate that? I know you work on that field, so draw from your own example. That's fine, but it's a very different headspace for urban scholars to be thinking about the places and the object that they're interested in, the city, as being important for a global process. What kind of work helps us demonstrate that?
So, as I said, I'm a geographer. I'm also trained as a remote sensing scientist. So my toolkit is primarily using satellite data. And so we've used satellite imagery to characterize the development of urban systems. Most of my work is situated in Asia. So I've worked in China, Vietnam, Qatar, Nepal, India, trying to using satellite data to again characterize urban systems, urban expansion. We also forecast urbanization and what that means for things like the urban heat island. In fact, I wanted to say, one of the work of one of my PhD students forecasted the growth of cities, urban land, going out to 2050, and showed that the heat or local climate change due to land change, due to building cities, will actually increase temperature more than greenhouse gas emissions driven climate change. So in fact, cities driving their own climate change. So my toolkit is really remote sensing. I want to emphasize that when we use satellite data, we always couple it with field work. There's a real danger of relying only on the satellite data to tell you what's happening on the ground, because one of the things we've learned is that the same patterns in two different places may reflect two radically different uses of the land, the cultural, social meanings of the land. And so, when we think about, and I think this is your second webinar, when we think about the policy implications, we absolutely need to pair the big data with boots on the ground, really, individual city knowledge. That I think is really cannot be underscored enough.
Absolutely. And
these two really have to work together.
Absolutely. And Tim, I mean, you must experience that as a tension, because transport is a sector that, everybody understands their local transport problems and dilemmas and investments. But how do you make transport research scale up to the global?
Well, there are many different ways you can do it, but one thing we've been working on over the last couple of years is related to electric vehicles, and they're an actually a really interesting thing. First of all, because they are predominantly used in cities and are often seen as a good thing in that context, because they clean up the air, fewer CO2 emissions, so many benefits. But then if you think about this in a global sense, the story becomes a bit more complicated. And we talk what transport people and energy people talk a lot about cradle to grave, and which is really about sort of thinking about the whole life course of what goes into an electric vehicle, and particularly the battery. So there's now a fair bit of work that shows the quite problematic effects of the mining that is needed for the elements that go into the battery. So there's studies about Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, and not only the labor conditions, but also the urbanization that this is triggering. There's lots of work on geopolitical tensions in different parts of the world, sort of the lithium triangle in Latin America is a very good example of that. But we don't think as much yet about the afterlife of these vehicles and what we need to do in order to recycle these materials, and how we're going to deal with electric vehicles as a form of waste. And it's particularly interesting if we think about this in the context of Africa, because many of the cars that we see in Africa are imported from elsewhere, particularly from Europe, which, if we're talking about electric vehicles, has huge implications on batteries for two reasons. It means that the conventional institutional regimes that are in place in in Europe and North America about the producer's responsibility for responsible processing of the waste don't hold. So there's a bit of an institutional wasteland, if you like. The other point is that waste is part of all sorts of urban informal economies in Africa, particularly, not only in Africa, but in many African countries. And it's very important for many people's livelihoods. And you can see that if batteries were to end up with other types of waste, as has happened with e-waste, or is happening with e-waste at the moment, you get people who would be very keen on getting their hands, literally their hands, on these batteries. But this is also where you get a health risk, a major health risk, because of the toxicity of the materials in those batteries. So you see that sort of, if you think about this whole life course, you're bringing together different geographical locations, different scales, and different topics and areas of study that are typically separated, because this is not only about transport, it is also about urbanization, it's also about mining, it's resource extraction, geopolitics, and health. They all come together, and they all need to work together to make sense of this topic.
So thanks.
Can I jump in here about the EVs for a moment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's another element of the EVs that I think is interesting. That, okay, so in the last two IPCC reports, I co-led the chapter on how cities can mitigate climate change. And as I said earlier, urban areas contribute to about 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the principal ways that cities can reduce their carbon footprint is by urban design, by putting people closer to the places that they want to be, right? So put housing closer to jobs or schools. So that's a kind of a low-tech solution to change people's behavior so that they could walk and bike. I think that EVs are really important for so many different reasons, because it's decarbonizing the electrical feed. But I think there's a real danger, at least in the US context, that EVs are really heavy. They're much heavier than other cars, and they often are bigger. And it locks us into this behavior, the idea that we have to drive. We're just going to swap out the gas car for the EV and we just keep driving. But in fact, some of this, I won't say simple, but some of the low-tech solutions that have been proven to work is redesign your cities so that they are more walkable. Put housing closer where jobs are. And then we wouldn't need the EVs. So I think there's anyway a real danger of locking into the idea that we have to have technology solve our problem, and that this new technology creates new problems. I mean, in the United States, there's been a recent report that shows that pedestrian deaths are at an all-time high. And that's partly because we drive such massive cars that are very, very heavy, and that the roads are not designed for humans, they're designed by cars or designed for cars. So I think, again, this is like needing a reframing. Instead of thinking about technology as the solution, are there low-tech solutions for our cities that every city could deploy?
So to pick up on that question of reframing and look at some of the questions which have come in, and there's some fabulous questions. If I can just highlight a couple, they may not get a one-on-one answer. But the question I think of lots of questions about kind of, can we be more specific about biodiversity and the impact of health and the relationship between health and climate? And we can come back to that if we've got time, although I think Karen has directly spoken to that. And then there's a question about how do you make local communities accountable and party to the big climate commitments? In other words, they're brokered through national processes, but the problems I experience locally is their way to get city leaders to buy into that. And I suppose related to that is there's a question about whether the current setup of the UN is really the best way to deal with this. I'm actually going to park that question because we're going to pick up on it very specifically in the next discussion. And I think it's we will make sure that it's front and center of our starting point for next week and pick up on that. But Karen, you talked about a headspace change, and there are two questions here about a headspace, which I think require a headspace change, which are around how do we bring cities from the developing world into the foreground of the discussion about sustainability, and relatedly, what do you really do about the way that Africa is brought into the discussion about sustainable development, particularly considering that the urban-rural continuum there is so much more significant. So if anybody wants to come in on those, I can happily pick up on both the health and the Africa one. And then if there are any other questions, do keep, there are more coming. We'll come back to them in another round. So Tim, Karen, and then I'll pop in, and then we'll get to the next batch of questions.
So which question do you want me to answer?
I think the challenge, Tim, I mean, you started speaking, and I like the way you coupled the discussion about Africa and EVs and waste. But I wonder if you could be more specific in the transport sector, both about the differences in the nature of the challenge that transport represents when you are thinking globally, but also about the way that the North and the South are in fact connected through transportation.
Yeah, so I'm going to couple this on one of the questions, which is about global air transport, which I think is a very interesting point, because I think when it comes to transport and climate, people really worry about daily transport, and that's sensible on many levels. But if we're moving forward, the biggest challenges really lie with maritime and with aviation, because Karen is absolutely right. We should not put all our we should not depend too much on technological change, but technological change has a role to play. And the problem with aviation is that there is no alternative. Whatever the aviation sector representatives tell you, there is no scalable alternative to what we've got at the moment. And that is bringing huge problems, because we foresee a gigantic growth in aviation, both on the passenger and particularly also on the freight side. And most of that growth is going to happen in the global south, and that's going to be really interesting, because what does that mean? Are we going to say to people, you can't fly, or we should actively discourage people from flying in the way that people in Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand have been doing for decades. It's real difficult questions there to answer. Some of these questions also play out on the more daily type of transport, where we see that too, where actually I sometimes show my students a photo of a city, and I let them guess what it is. And they think it's a city in the US, but it isn't. It is sprawl in West Africa. And it looks very similar to what we see in certain parts of the US. And we see the car dependence that is built into this system, and public transport is not going to be a realistic alternative in those kinds of circumstances. On the other hand, this is for younger families. In order to have their own house, an affordable house, you almost have to live in the suburbs far away, because those are the only places that are affordable for many people. At least in a city like Accra, where the land market is organized in such a way that you really have to look at the outskirts of the city for the affordable housing, and that means buying a car, or being reliant on a car, possibly a second car even. So we see developments we've seen for a long time in Europe and North America, and we need to think about what kind of solutions that may require, and those will have to be tailored to the local context. They're not going to be the same as what we've tried to do in the US and in Europe.
Karen, before I come back to you on quite a specific question, and I wanted to pick up on the Africa question, and I'm not entirely sure it is an explicitly Africa question, although it was framed that way in the question we've got before us. Because it's, of course, what's true for Africa is also true for quite a lot of South Asia. In other words, places where urbanization is still at relatively low levels, but is taking place unbelievably fast, and where the pressures on the ground are incredibly intense, and there is a tendency to face to have an experience of the tension between the political imperatives of development and the aspirations for a better quality of life, which are completely and utterly A, justified, and B, overt, and create for a political volatility on the one hand, and then this kind of wider consciousness of we need to do things differently, we need to do things in a different way. And I think I've been relatively centrally involved in some of the debates about urban policy on the African context. And for me, what's been very, very significant there has been the recognition by urban leaders on the continent that not only do they have the capacity to influence their own futures, in other words, they don't have to buy into the two-car EV or otherwise model of city development, but that to take all of their constituency and residents with them, it is going to have to be a solution that takes on board substantive issues about informal settlements, about fundamentals like access to clean water, about the reduction of risk from massive imposition of climate change, because the infrastructure in African cities is just of such a very poor quality that even relatively storms that probably wouldn't make a difference or even really be noticed in anything other than the news, where we might argue that weather forecasters can be melodramatic, really do fundamentally destroy urban livelihoods and take a very long time to restore. And I think for me, what's been significant about the galvanizing of a global policy imaginary on the African continent is A, that they have shaped it by ensuring that it isn't only about mitigation of a very particular kind. And I think if you look at SDG 11, you will see that there are really substantial areas which speak directly to the issues of the global south. But perhaps more importantly, that it's seen a bit of a shift of policy on the continent, which has turned from being a very anti-urban orientation to one that really, I think, has begun to think about, if not operationalize effectively, big questions like, what do you do with the resources that are available globally? In other words, if you are going to land up with restitution funds in place, how are they going to be used? Who's going to own them? And so this emergence of a global consciousness of cities is a potentially potent vehicle, both externally, but also internally. And I would argue has therefore been a force for good. What it means going forward, I think, is absolutely crucial. And this is a kind of a pivot moment for the AU, who are beginning to start to think about what they are actually going to have as their urban policy. It's a pivot point when South Africa hosts the G20. It's a pivot point when we build up to the new SDGs. What is going to be the position of the Global South in the encounters and the formulation of a new global imaginary for cities? And so I know that lots of people on the call have got this as a fairly central concern, and I suspect it's going to be you that's going to be doing that articulation, that demand, be lobbying in that space. So yeah, would strongly encourage you to take that up. So, Karen, leaving aside the African context and coming back to the global question and coming back to the strategic question, and quite a few of the questioners are talking about kind of how do you balance, or how do you weigh the importance of this global agenda, the conductor, the common song sheet, versus the idea of a general sense of what we should do, but local control and local implementation? Can you?
I like what you just said, Sue. Common song sheet is probably a better analogy than a conductor. We don't really need a conductor. We need a common song sheet. You know, the opportunities and the challenges are very different for the Global South than the Global North. And I want to provide two examples. I've already said now several times on this webinar that urban areas contribute to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. Those are cities and towns that have already been built. Those are places in existence. And yet we know that every 5 days, more or less, we're adding 1 million people into cities and towns globally. Every 5 days, 1 million people. That translates to something like 20,000 American football fields get built up into cities. And I'm sorry for an international audience, I don't know what that means for football fields or soccer fields, but 20,000 American football fields get converted from forest agriculture into cities every single day. And so and that's primarily in the Global South. So here's one of the big challenges, and I think opportunity for the Global South, is avoiding the lock-in. And here when I say lock-in, I'm referring to entrenchment, a path dependency of behavior. So there's a behavior component of locking in, like, do I drive my car to work? There's an institutional lock-in of, are there policies in place that, you know, that privilege cars, that privilege roads? And then there's a technological lock-in. Do I rely on the car, right? So there are these three critical types of lock-in, and we know that we can build cities that are highly functioning, that are good for human health, that are economically innovative and productive and culturally vibrant, that are really low tech. And this is maybe some of the most frustrating things is we in the Global North, and especially in North America, are exporting a particular style of urbanization that's primarily single family detached homes that require the car. But if we look at how cities were built 100 years ago, before the advent of the car, they were really around humans, and they were much more accessible places. So anyway, I think one of the big opportunities for the Global South is designing cities that are not around the car and built around humans and activities. And again, that's, I think we have the technology or the know-how to do that. And so I think the key issue there is the knowledge transfer, but you said something a little bit ago, Sue, that I wanted to highlight about urban leaders, right? I mean, I think there's so much pressure on urban leaders in the global south or even in the global north to do the right thing. But in fact, one of the things we know about how cities get built is that it's not just the urban leader. I mean, planners wish that they were the ones that designed and executed how cities are built. But in fact, there's so many different constituents and stakeholders that shape how cities are built. And we know that in the global south, a lot of this is informal. And so part of this is changing the public perception of what, you know, what modernization looks like. It's investors. But anyway, that's one of the big opportunities, is avoiding the lock-in. I think the other key issue is for the global north, what we need to do is redevelop our existing cities to make them low carbon. And that will require also some new urban planning, some technology. I think there's also an opportunity for technology transfer, but technology and knowledge transfer both ways. And here it's not about privileging one way of knowing or one way of building, operating cities. There are lots of examples of cities that are incredibly economically, culturally vibrant, that are low carbon. There's not one way to do this. I think that's really one of the big challenges, is not thinking that there's one way.
Well, that may be a nice segue into a particularly sensitive question, I thought, from a councillor in a new municipality in a relatively rural area. I imagine it's to be a place that is growing and growing quite rapidly, probably with not an enormous amount of resources. And the question is a very personal one. It says, I'd like to know what recommendations in terms of skills and knowledge are needed to acquire comprehensive expertise to make our cities sustainable. Tim, you have an answer.
Let me begin by saying it's really an excellent question. And it's, I think it can be answered in different ways, and probably all three of the people on the panel will have a slightly different answer to this. But I would say what you need is obviously an understanding, an ability to understand what is going on in your city and be able to understand some of the data that are being produced, however patchy those may be. But I think you also need to understand how the political systems in which your city is situated work. So you need to understand the relationship with national government, with cities elsewhere, kind of the city networks, relationships with UN level organizations or the international circuit in which urban knowledge is circulating. And I think that is some political science. There's an element of geography to that. I think that is really an important element that perhaps doesn't get stressed enough in the urban skill developments that I'm familiar with. And that certainly when it comes to transport, the emphasis is always on the hardware, on things like infrastructure, how you build a BRT, a bus rapid transit system, how you build bike lanes, those kinds of things. But I think a lot of it is really around understanding the systems in which you are situated and how you can mobilize these to your in a way that it works for you. So for instance, think about funding, think about trying to create more regulatory power about what is going on in your system, in your city. I think those questions are really important, and that really sort of require what we try to get at with Peak, that we don't have a generation of experts in one domain or in one discipline, but that we have that transdisciplinary expertise, and you're able to bring together different types of knowledge in a way that makes sense to the issues that your city is facing.
Thanks, Tim. Karen on that, and then I'm going to come in, and then I think we're going to wind up, even though we haven't answered every question. You want to come in on that one, Karen? What do you need to know, and what skills and knowledge are required to engage your city productively?
So I agree with Tim 150% that it is about understanding the systems that operate in a city, as well as linking what's happening in a city to regional and national governance institutions. I just really want to underscore something that Tim said, which is that I think oftentimes we think about the skills and knowledge as more, I think Tim said hardware, right? It's like, okay, I need to know these statistical tools, or in my field, a lot of students say, I need to know GIS, and the skill, the critical skill is really systems integration. It is understanding systems, understanding how to integrate them. And it's a much more difficult skill than it sounds, because it is, some of it is conceptual, but a lot of it is also working across spatial scales and thinking about how something that affects this place may be affected by something that's operating at a very, very different scale. So I think it's that systems thinking and systems integration. I just want to say, give a plug very quickly that we at Yale are in the process of launching a brand new online urban climate leadership certificate. We literally just launched it, I think last week. It is aimed for urban practitioners in the global South. We have scholarships, and it is to train urban practitioners in exactly these skills. It's these skills and knowledge. So I'll make sure to provide that with the organizers of the webinar. And just to underscore, we have scholarships.
Good. That's the most important thing when you're talking about those expensive American institutions. Perhaps my response also to that question is that I think that this is a virtual community of practice, but we are all concerned with common questions. And I think whether your town is small, facing very big problems on limited resources, or your town is very big with lots of very powerful vested interests, it's not easy. And so local knowledge, local expertise, and the capacity to work with other people is always going to be fundamental to getting things done, and recognizing that you're going to have to make strategic decisions. You're going to have to prioritize. You're going to have to understand the consequences of decisions that you make, and having the wisdom to know when to make them on your own, what evidence to take to support your decisions, and to make sure that you are in fact asking the right questions is something that is much, much easier done in dialogue with other people. And I think that's, for me, what is so rich about seeing the participants on this course. It's what's so important about being able to learn from places, even when we cannot get to those places. And so it's in that spirit, colleagues, that I'm just really grateful that you've given up a long hour of your time. I hope it's been rich and fruitful, and that we will pick up on this discussion next week when we convene again to focus much more explicitly. And quite a lot of the questions which I've left off, I think, will inform our discussion on the next occasion. So thank you very much for everybody. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.